Manny's is a civic and political event space and gathering space. We host nightly programs in this space on these themes. A little taste of just the last few days. On Friday, we had a 200-person Two-Spirit powwow indigenous drag show on this very stage with 12 Native American drag queens. And then we had a book talk. Sure, yeah. I mean, I didn't perform, but it was really amazing. And then after that, we had a book talk on queer spiritual practices, jazz, and we had jazz in the front. And then the next day, Saturday, we had Black Gay Brunch. It's an organization that does great brunch for black gay men. We had 70 black gay men having brunch here together. It was super beautiful. We went through 40 bottles of champagne. It was a good time. And then Sunday we had our weekly trash pickup. We had over 50 people show up and pick up trash in the neighborhood, which was necessary because there was a lot of wet, strange trash that needed collecting. So that was just the weekend, and it's Monday. Can you believe it? So tonight's conversation is on the normalization of anti-Semitism. It's something that we've been planning for a while, and very thankful that you would come at this hour, late on a Monday night, to talk about this important and serious subject. It's something that, of course, hits very close to home for me personally. Before we start, please take 30 seconds, introduce yourself to someone around you that you do not already know, and maybe just do that. I don't have a funny question about anti-Semitism, so just introduce yourself to someone you don't already know. All right, that's good. That's it. Let's bring our guests to the stage. No more friendships. No more fun. We're gonna bring our esteemed guest to the stage, the state senator of San Francisco, Scott Wiener, to over here. Come. And Tyler Gregory. Huh? Yeah. You go to the mustard colored. You go to the mustard colored one. And Ty, you go to the middle one. Ty is the CEO of the Jewish Community Relations Council. Oh. Yeah.
Can we talk about coyotes and feral cats?
We already did that. You missed it. We talked about, which by the way, it was intense. So yeah. I was very much thinking like, animal care and control would be very lighthearted, and anti-Semitism would be the downer. But both I guess are downers. Yeah, seriously.
Yeah,
come on.
People think housing politics are hard, but then you get into animal politics, and boy.
Yeah. I guess I don't listen. Here's the thing. I guess what we could do is just start with identifying the problem, and my first question is like, is it real? Like, I guess I want to. When I was talking to friends about this, they're like, anti-Semitism, it's always been around. You know, it's just kind of a feature of society. And I guess I want to know, is it actually getting worse? Like, is the problem of anti-Semitism in this country getting worse? And so I guess I have some stats and data, but maybe it would be okay to start from your personal experience, both of you, and kind of what you're experiencing right now in your life and what you're seeing. Maybe start with you, Senator.
So thanks for having me. This is an amazing turnout. So thank you for doing this, and it's really important. And the answer is, anti-Semitism has always been around. There's a reason why it's called the oldest hatred. But I do believe it's getting worse, and particularly more brazen and open, and which had changed because it used to be was very brazen and open, sometimes in really extreme ways, and then it got quieter because it was considered unacceptable, and now it's become acceptable again. And I've definitely experienced, in terms of my own journey, when I grew up in a very non-Jewish community. I was one of 2 Jewish kids in my high school class of 550 kids. When we moved there in the early 70s, our neighbors asked us why we didn't have horns. And then when I was in 6th grade, our social studies class had a whole section on how the Jews begged Jesus, or begged the Romans to kill Jesus. So it was definitely there. But I felt like over time it was really reduced. And now the number of times that I have anti-Semitic comments directed at me online is extraordinary. It's very different than even like 4 or 5 years ago. And so I think the Pandora's box was opened. And so a lot of that stuff that was underneath the surface just bubbled out and became acceptable again on a political level.
What are people saying to you?
Well, you can check it out for yourself on my Twitter feed. It's really, actually, I do not recommend. You should look at what I tweet, but the toxicity that follows is really extraordinary, and the homophobia. Just a lot of anti-Semitic slurs that are directed at me. Sometimes they're in like messages, but sometimes they're just right out there in the open, and it's about being part of the international conspiracy, and just a lot of the standard tropes about Jews, and it often gets mixed up with the fact that I'm a gay man. So Jewish, gay, we're all deviants, and all the other words that they use. Groomers, Jewish groomer. That's one of the Jewish
You
groomer.
get called Jewish groomer?
Jewish groomer, yeah.
And we're not talking about animals again, right?
No, no.
Okay.
What about you? You just you run the Jewish Community Relations Council. Anti-Semitism has been an issue that you've tried to tackle in the few years that you've run it, and you also just did a study, I think, of the Jews of the Bay Area. So can you talk a little bit about the work that you're trying to do at the JCRC, if you think it's getting worse, and tell me about this study.
Yes, it's getting worse. Good night. Okay, so listen. Yes, it's getting worse, but the conditions have always been there for it to be a problem when society gets more polarized, when the extremes rise in society. So if you go back, let's take the American context out of the equation for a second. Anti-Semitism tends to be the worst fears of a society, the ultimate outsider, the ultimate enemy. So in communist Soviet Union, the Jews were the capitalists. And in fascist Europe, the Jews were the communists, the ultimate other. In the Middle Ages, in Christianity, Jews were the Christian baby killers, right? Jews were made out to be the ultimate thing that the society at the time feared the most. So if you bring it to the present with the society that we have now, on the far right, white supremacists, and we've had some very troubling incidents in recent months and even week, which we can talk about, Jews are responsible for the Great Replacement theory, right? We look at Charlottesville. And on the opposite side of the equation, Jews, in particular white Jews, are made out to be the ultimate white supremacists, and sometimes that manifests in anti-Semitism when it comes to Israel, which is something that we can get to. I know you wanted to one-up the controversy from earlier. So Jews are always made out to be the ultimate outsider, the ultimate other, and that is how anti-Semitism has manifested, and that's what we're experiencing today.
I guess that's kind of, I didn't even think about that. There's the like Jew as the white supremacist, the white overlord, and then there's
Ultimate privilege.
right, and that's a la like Kanye West, DEFCON 3 onto the Jews, like they're controlling the world, like let's get rid of them. And then there's the Jews will not replace us, which is like Jews are some kind of like, like deviant or like less than like species that are like.
It's also a form of a conspiracy, right? Because the idea is that brown and black
we're
people...
We're coming out of the mouths of white supremacists,
Yeah.
actual white supremacists.
Exactly. So we wanted to commission a study because oftentimes, not with this guy, but many times people say, oh, anti-Semitism is something that's like a red state problem that's only on the far right. So we said, okay, let's commission a study by a credible pollster, EMC, which does a lot of campaign work in the Bay Area. And they polled 900 Jews randomly, voter rolls, to identify names. And they said, what are your experiences with anti-Semitism? More than 1 in 3 have personally experienced or witnessed anti-Semitism since the pandemic began. Random sample size. And when it comes to social, we asked people what different settings they felt uncomfortable in, and our public schools and social media were the two most cited spaces in which anti-Semitism was manifesting today. And this is not unique to the Jewish community, especially these two things, but like we need to make sure that superintendents and school board members recognize that this isn't fast times at Ridgemont High, right? People aren't being bullied for Jewish in front of a locker. They're being bullied on TikTok. And it's a lot harder for teachers and administrators to recognize those problems in the moment. And we need to re-educate them about how to identify those problems, those triggers, and what to do about them, because times have changed, and we need to catch up to those times as well. A lot of it is digital first, and the relentless harassment against the senator is just one prime example of how this is turning into an ugly situation.
You mentioned the kind of even greater rise in anti-Semitic violence from a week ago, and I think, did you say you're from the Schneerson Center in Richmond? Do you mind telling us what happened in your synagogue last week? Stand up so we can see you. What's your name?
Alon Chanukov.
Nice to meet you, Alon.
Thank you. I lost my voice recently, not related to this situation, but yeah, so I am the gabbai, kind of a junior rabbi, and congregant / vice president of the board of the Schneerson Center. I can honestly say that while I have experienced anti-Semitism, what was experienced by our synagogue in the last week is something that is kind of on the unheard of level in my mind, where it's surreal. There was a person who walked in during a class / celebration that the rabbi was doing. It was mostly attended by at that point, some elderly people. Most of the young people have already left to do other things. And the rabbi, being that he sees that this is a person who speaks Russian, the Schneerson Center is a Jewish center / synagogue for specifically targeting the Russian-speaking community who may not feel as comfortable in an American synagogue because they don't speak the language, they don't have the same culture exactly. And he invites the person to sit down and tries to continue the class. This person pulls out a gun and starts shooting. Now, later we find out the gun is not real, it seems like, based on police evidence. Later, we find out that this person, based on his own Twitter, is a big fan of SS uniforms and actual Nazi German propaganda, like in German, the original, which he posts on his own Twitter. But it was surreal to me, and a part of the surreality, I want to say, no one reported that night, in the elderly people there. And the reason no one reported is because how normalized and untreated anti-Semitism is almost. The elderly man that is seen on the video kind of walking towards him and kind of shooing him away / trying to take a phone call, because in the beginning the person didn't even realize this was happening. He was just trying to take a phone call. He told me, less than a year ago, some homeless person punched him out and called him out as an effing kike in the street. He reported that to the police, and no charges were made. Yes, they took him away, and I'm assuming released him somewhere else. I had to call the police personally in the morning when I found out about what happened and saw the video footage, because I was scared for my kids, I was scared for my community, I was scared this person would come back. We're not one of the big temples, one of the big synagogues we're small. The size of this place is actually pretty close as far as our synagogue.
Some people call it big, some people call it small. It depends.
No, it's a
Depends what you're
wonderful
looking at.
place.
Thank you.
But just like here, in fact, we have more glass to our entrance. And our whole synagogue, this place has multiple rooms. We don't have that. We have just like a main entranceway. And imagine that door right there. You enter, and now you're in the synagogue. As I watched in horror, like, I can also speak that I come from Poway. I grew up going to Chabad of Poway as a kid who was non-observant at the time. And my mother was almost ended up being there when that shooting happened. And when the police arrested this person, he was not, the initial charges, I hope that they are changed, were not hate crime, were not active terrorism. They were shooting an imitation gun and disturbing a religious assembly, which is practically true, but is like, it's taking a trauma that a whole community experienced where there are people who are having a hard time sleeping. There are people who literally, as he was shooting, believe that they don't know how many minutes they have left to live. If like it is terrifying. I was shaken the next day. We have people, so we run one of the only synagogues in town, if not we run the most consistent minyan. For those who don't know what a minyan is, there is an obligation by Jewish law to have 10 men pray with a quorum so that you could say the special prayer for the dead. Specifically, like one of the things that you cannot say, if God forbid someone loses a father or mother, they have to say Kaddish. According to Jewish law, this Kaddish can only be said if there is a quorum of 10 men. And so we provide this for not just ourselves. We have guests from all over the world come to us because if you're in the Bay Area, if you're in San Francisco for whatever business trip, and you want to daven Mincha Maariv, you'll leave your hotel downtown where there's nothing Mincha Maariv, and you'll come to us. And we always want to be this welcoming. And now we're in a place where we're trying to figure out, do we bulletproof the glass of the shul, or ideally we're at this point looking to see if we can figure out a way where we can move to a more secure location and still the same neighborhood.
Thank you, Mr. Simontov. I appreciate it. Thank you for telling us the story. Let's give him a round of applause for his courage.
Well, thank you for telling this story. And, you know, both of us lived it secondhand working with the San Francisco Police Department. I was in touch with the district attorney throughout the weekend. We both marched in the Lunar New Year parade, and every single elected official, you know, this is top of mind for folks. And unfortunately, I think it's unfortunate, there's a whole department within the Jewish Federation that has to deal with community security. And one of the top legislative issues for the Jewish Caucus and for my organization, JCRC, is community security, making sure that our institutions have that bulletproof glass and have that security because we fear for it. And we should not have to approach Jewish life from a place of protection, but a place of Jewish joy. So we do these things reluctantly, but necessarily out of our own self-protection.
I hear that, and I think it sounds like an important short-term measure, but like, what could we do? Is there something that we could do to make it so that far fewer people want to do harm to Jews in America?
I mean, that's, I guess, in the broader issue of radicalization in this country, because part of the issue that people get caught into these wormholes on social media where they basically become brainwashed. And so, yeah, you have people who have always been anti-Semitic, or they were raised in a certain way, but then you have other people who, you know, they just become literally brainwashed, whether brainwashed to think that vaccines are killing them, or that all gay men are pedophiles, or that drag queens are trying to do whatever they're saying drag queens are doing, and they get into a wormhole that Jews are doing X, Y, and Z horrible things, and they become indoctrinated. And so we're trying to hold social media platforms more accountable for actually dealing with this, what's happening in that realm, which is absolutely harmful. And we also, at a political level, we need to, I don't want to get too partisan here, but we have one political party that is not holding its own members accountable for saying these horrible things. I mean, we have a member of Congress who talked about Jewish space lasers, who is now one of the most powerful members of the House of Representatives. And so we have to have accountability in politics and for political discourse in terms of what's acceptable.
I just want to stay on social media for a second, because I feel like while this is not a conversation about social media, you can't kind of untangle anti-Semitism and social media today. So you kind of touched on this already, Senator, but I guess I wonder, maybe from your perspective, like how much is social media to blame for the rise in the belief in anti-Semitic tropes, and then specifically, like, what do you think from a policy perspective should be done to eliminate the prevalence of anti-Semitism
Well,
on social media?
what social media does is pour lighter fluid on whatever is there. So social media doesn't create it, but it used to be that some of these people who had certain views, certain fringe beliefs, they were there, but social media allowed them to find each other and then to spin things up and sort of recruit new people into these like unhinged beliefs. And so that's the power of and social media. There's a lot of good on social media, right? There's a lot of good on social media, but this is the downside. And the platforms don't do enough to deal with the extremism, the hate, even the threats. And we learned when I went through my first tidal wave of death threats back in 2020, we learned which platforms were taking it seriously and which weren't. By the way, a platform that did take it seriously then, that doesn't anymore, but that was Twitter. I got a lot less of the threats and the hate on Twitter than on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and that's all. It's the opposite right now because Elon Musk has turned Twitter into just a hate machine, and it's been a noticeable difference. So when platforms really try hard to manage that kind of toxic, disgusting stuff, it doesn't eliminate it. We're not asking for perfection, but it does make a difference. And when they stop, it does make a difference.
Let's go one level deeper. What do you think it means that so many people are so susceptible to being spun up with these anti-Semitic tropes? Like, do you feel like there's this like seed in folks that it with the right amount of like memes and whatever, it can just come out? Like, I just wonder why is it the Jewish thing? Why is social media able to like whip this up so easily?
I will say, and I do want to hear what Ty's, but I haven't. When I remember back to a few years ago, the things that they tend to go after me on are bills that I do around LGBTQ equality. That's another thing. Homophobia and transphobia has become intensely normalized online, in particular, and the things that people say. It's very similar in terms of the rise. There was a bill I did, and there was all this like crazy MAGA QAnon misinformation about it. And there was someone I know who's a very like educated, informed person who made a comment, a gay man who made a comment to me about the bill. Like, clearly he had seen a bunch of stuff like over and over again on his like Facebook feed. And then I told him, I said, no, that's wrong. This is what it is. He's like, oh yeah, oh my God, I feel really horrible that I even thought that. But he just saw it over and over again. It has a subtle impact. And psychologically, as human beings, we're susceptible when you see things over and over and over. And that's what social media is designed to do, to sort of suck you in and have that level of addiction. And they're not in any way accountable for that.
What do you think about all this?
I think education is key here, and like going back to not being partisan, but a little bit anyways. Everyone's talking about this controversy around AP African American Studies and Ron DeSantis' threat to eliminate it. That's getting the headlines, but we're also seeing in some rural districts the elimination of Holocaust studies. And that's deeply, deeply troubling that we've gotten to the point where we're so polarized that we can't even talk about anyone's difference, let alone the murder of 6 million Jews systemically during World War II. But I take it a few steps further than that, because the Holocaust or World War II, that was, depending on how you want to measure it, 5 to 12 years of the Jewish world experience, and not 3,500 years. And we're doing our community a huge disservice. And I know other communities feel flattened, that their stories are being told in 2 dimensions. That's one reason why we're bringing ethnic studies into our K-12 schools. It's an opportunity for our community and other ethnic and racial minorities to tell our story in 3 dimensions, to make people know that there are multiracial Jews. There are Jews of color. There are Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews. We have different experiences. We come from all over the world. And Jewish identity looks different for some of us. Some of us are Haredim, ultra-Orthodox, and some of us, like me, are deeply secular. I'll go and get bacon for breakfast. Fine. That doesn't make me any less Jewish. Just means that I have a different palate, okay? So it's critical that we are understanding the diversity of the Jewish American and the global Jewish experience, and that starts in our schools. So I truly believe that the best way we can combat this is by normalizing Jewish identities of different forms and not just, summarizing us to 2 lines in ancient civilizations on ancient Israel and then a chapter on the Holocaust. There's 3,500 years to pick from.
Yeah, it's hard. I feel like we need to become more comfortable with when something happens around us that isn't direct anti-Semitism, right? Like, it's not like people are coming up, people have not come up to me and called me a kike. But like the other day, I had a spat between 2 neighbors around here, and one of them said that the other one was spreading rumors that she extorted me when I came to this neighborhood, that I paid her off. And so I said, well, that's not true. You didn't ask me for any money, and I didn't give you any money. And she said, well, you tell the other neighbor that's not true. So I go to the other neighbor and I say, hey, I saw that you were telling people that I was extorted by this neighbor, and I didn't. She never asked me for money. I didn't give her any money. And he said, uh-huh, okay, fine. I'll take it back. And then I found out a week later, he sent a different email saying that I went around and bought allegiances from all these organizations in the mission, except for this person. And so I went to him and said, I saw that email also. And he said, well, that's what you did, didn't you? You came here with all your money, and you went around and you bought people off. And I said, don't you see how that's kind of anti-Semitic? Just like assume that I came here with all this money, this Jewish money, into the neighborhood and just sprinkled it around to get people to like me. I didn't do that. But maybe you should wonder why you just assume that I came here with all this money. What's that about?
It's just a different form of implicit bias. In the same way that the 3 of us face implicit bias as gay men, there are often times throughout the world where we're going to walk around and there's going to be implicit bias against us for being Jewish. And you've identified one of them, this idea that Jews have power, control, or resources. When I lived in New York, I learned a troubling statistic. Almost a third of remaining Holocaust survivors in the New York City metro area live below the New York City poverty line, okay? So if the Jews have all these resources, why are we still facing that problem? It's embarrassing, in my opinion. Conversation for a different day. But the reality is we need to make sure that folks understand what implicit bias looks like in the Jewish context, just like we're talking about it for people of color, queer folks, trans folks, etc. We have our own set of implicit bias issues to work through.
Okay, I promised Scott I'd let him get home to Sacramento at a reasonable hour tonight. So I'm just going to have a couple more questions, and then we'll get to audience questions. Before we hit we get a little more controversial, I'm going to tell you about a couple stats from the very recent ADL study that came out just a few weeks ago. It was on this question of the normalization of anti-Semitism. It said that over 3/4, 85% of Americans that they polled believe at least one anti-Jewish trope. That's opposed to 61% in 2019. 20% of Americans believe 6 or more tropes, which is significantly more than the 11% found in 2019. And some of these tropes are quite pernicious. One of them, which 20% of Americans believe that Jews are more willing than others to use shady practices to get what they want. So they believe that that is true for all Jews. Almost done. Many Americans believe in Israel-oriented anti-Semitic positions, which one of them was 40% who believe that Israel treats Palestinians like the Nazis treated the Jews, and 18% of them are uncomfortable spending time with a person who supports Israel. And the last thing is that, and this might not surprise folks, is that this is much more prevalent around young people and Gen Z folks than Gen X, Gen Y. At least only 63% of Gen Z individuals believe that Israel had a right to exist. Baby boomers, that's 90 to 95%. 63%. No. So those are kind of the stats, which when I read that, I was like, the most troubling thing was that 85% of Americans believe in at least one anti-Semitic Jewish trope. Does that surprise you, Scott, what other things I just read?
No, and again, it's not always malicious. Because I've met people in my life who they don't necessarily know. They don't know a lot of Jews. They just sort of hear certain things, and once they are educated or have more experience, they don't believe that anymore. I had a former colleague in the state senate who I think probably hadn't known very many Jews before coming to the legislature. And I remember this must have been a couple years after the 2016 election, with everything happening in Charlottesville, et cetera. And he came up to me and he said, I never realized they really, really hate you. And he had just never known. He had just had no idea, and probably had a lot of the stereotypes that Jews were all good, wealthy, powerful, super privileged. And it wasn't until he saw a bunch of things that he realized, as he put it, they really, really, really hate you, and they want you to die. And for him, that was totally mind-opening. And I suspect he probably had some stereotypes, and I have a feeling that those stereotypes melted away once he saw what was going on. And so once people see, those numbers, I think, start going down. And also about Holocaust education, because the polling on Holocaust, on knowledge that the Holocaust ever happened, knowledge about it, Holocaust skepticism or denialism, is absolutely appalling. And that's why we have been working to try to increase Holocaust education in our schools.
Okay, we're going to end our portion with some solutions, but before we get that, I want to talk about kind of the pickle that folks found themselves in a bit with the whole Kanye West, Kyrie Irving thing. For those who don't know, Kanye West, I don't know how you would know, but Kanye West tweeted all these really crazy anti-Semitic things. They got like progressively worse. They got like crazier and crazier until they just became so violent and anti-Semitic that even Elon Musk had to kick him off Twitter. And Kyrie Irving posted a link, he's a basketball player, posted a link to a documentary that openly questions the Holocaust, whether it happened or not. Had kind of like a relatively strong apology, but there was this back and forth about the ability for that to be acceptable stuff for a famous person to post. The thing that hit me about it was Jews involved in fighting anti-Semitism called attention to the kind of paradox that you sometimes find yourself in. If the community claps back and shuts down a person who's claiming that Jews are in charge, that Jews are pulling all the strings, for those who are already inclined to believe that Jews are somehow pulling the strings of the world, when Kanye posts something and then all the companies remove him, in some ways, it's at proving this belief. It's kind of proving the fight. Like the Jews are gonna take me down. Just watch it happen. And then when the punishment happens, there's this almost like side conversation that, look, see, he was right. Kyrie Irving, he's losing his seat. Like the Jews got him. And so I guess I wanted to. I read that. I'm like, I actually totally relate to that. I almost felt didn't want to call out Kanye West or Kyrie Irving because I didn't want to play into this stereotype actually of Jews. Holding all this power. And so I guess what is your advice? Like what should the people in this room do? What should Jews do, non-Jews, when they see this stuff and think that something should happen?
Well, first of all, because non-Jews have to call people out too for anti-Semitism, you need your allies, whether it's white people standing with black people or straight people standing with LGBTQ people. And non-Jews standing with Jews. So it's not just the Jews doing it, but it has to be called out. I mean, they're going to say it, and yes, does it feed into that? But if it's not, and sometimes we have to do our own calling out. We just have to. And with Kanye, the thing that was so disturbing, and we learned a lot more over time, yes, he clearly has some real issues in general, just in his life and his mental health. But he's been like praising Hitler for many, many years. Like it turns out, I mean, he's just a straight up, and it's not just because he had a meltdown and the anti-Semitism somehow manifested from that. He truly believes this. And so it was long overdue for him to be called out. And apparently, all this stuff that we learned afterwards is like, why weren't people calling him out before? When he was making these comments on the set and and no people were not calling him out. And so at some point you just got to do it, even if there's a backlash.
So I would say a couple things. Jewish identity is not bound by skin color. There are African American Jews and there are Ethiopian Jews, and then there are Jews that need SPF 2000, and everything in between. Okay, and so therefore anti-Semitism is also not bound by color. So anti-Semitism can manifest in any community when anything is taken to an extreme. Look, it's a complicated relationship, and one of the things that we at JCRC do is we have intimate conversations with different communities. We're doing a lot of work in Chinatown with the API community. We're doing a lot of work in Oakland right now with African American community leaders. These conversations of trust building aren't going to happen on Twitter. These are things that we need to work on together to build trust, to build relationships, and find ways to work together. And so that hard work isn't always visible, but it's incredibly important to make sure that that trust is there, so that if there's a member of that community that is being attacked, that there are black leaders for us to partner with to help us through those conversations, because we recognize that we don't want to inadvertently alienate our allies or do something counterproductive in that moment. Given the choice, to answer your other question about, oh, you know, what do we do if we're perceived to be privileged if we work on these corporate things like with Adidas? Given the choice, you know, they already don't like us. Why shouldn't we be treated equally to other communities when incidents of homophobia and anti-black racism are happening, you know, coming from elected officials or actors? When they're doing that, those people, you know, face the consequences. But for some reason, we Jews are too skeptical of our own instincts to take charge in the moment and do something about it. If you are going to remove someone from a platform because they've done something racist or they've done something transphobic, why should we as Jews not, you know, move forward with that initial instinct to get the same thing? By telling folks that they need to be careful, we are disempowering Jews, in particular young Jews, from using their voice and speaking up to confront and dismantle anti-Semitism. So given that choice, I will not. I think it's our responsibility and the responsibility of our allies to speak up just like we do for other communities.
Could I say something?
Actually, we're going to get to the audience portion in just a minute. So is it directly responding to Ty's statement that you just said?
Well, the police can't be everywhere, and they can't. You all have to have guns. You and all of you need to carry guns, and I mean it.
Okay.
Because the police can't be everywhere.
Well,
I'm
not
not Republican.
not necessarily.
No, I'm not.
Not necessarily, but what is your name?
Jeffrey,
Jeffrey.
Jeffrey.
Thank you for your comment. Much appreciated. Angelina just put a slide on the TV on the screen. I just wanted to. This is our final question. We've been talking about this, but obviously there was some assumed answer in the question of Mr. Simintov. It's okay. It's okay. I know it's a room full of Jews, but you know we gotta and non-Jews and our friends. So this is the result of the study. They had a graph, and it is a little bit shocking. But these were the anti-Semitic tropes that they polled Americans on, going from 1964 to 2022. And you can see there was a very strong downward trend. And then just in 2019, right, which was the last time Jews were polled, this immense increase. Obviously, lots happened in the world. I think we've touched on social media and the prevalence of social media and Donald Trump. But I would love to just end our conversation on a hopeful note. Like, what would you say if everyone in this room can leave, and what can they do to try to begin reversing this trend? And what kind of, if not that, what as a society can we do to kind of go back to what we previously were, which were less and less instances of anti-Semitism being believed by the American public? Let's start with you, Ty.
Look, anti-Semitism is not who we are as Jews. It's something that we face. And we can't make it a central theme. We can't make it a feature of what Jewish identity and life means. It's a bug. And it's been around for a while. It'll be around for a while. So the best thing that we can do is invite non-Jews to our Passover Seders and to our Shabbat dinners. Invite them to experience Jewish joy. Invite them into community with you. For non-Jews in the room, find places to plug in. Approach a Jewish friend about these issues. Just like any community that feels like an outsider, a lot of the positive momentum happens in casual conversations. You don't need to run a Jewish organization or be a state legislator to make change on these issues. It is about shared experience. And so the more we can bring people that aren't like us into that shared experience and experience Jewish joy and Jewish life, the more change we can make to change people's attitudes about us. It's a lot harder to hate us when you know us.
I love that. I was gonna say, Precious knows more about Purim, Tu Bishvat. She's ran how many Passover setters did you run this past year? I mean, we had a lot, 4 Purim events coming on, so we are practicing that right here at Manny's. And thank you, Precious. What can we do? You are a legislator, policymaker, leader. What can we
I
do?
mean, the good news is when you see it in those charts, we know for decades, anti-Semitism, at least as expressed, was going down, that we were moving away from very, very ugly history and things were getting better. And then it's spiked again in the last few years. There's nothing inevitable about that. There are political explanations and other explanations for why that happened. And we can turn it around again. That requires, dealing with social media issues, it requires accountability for people in politics who are trying to fuel the flames, and we know that that is happening. And it requires education of our kids. And that's why we need to make sure, every single member of our Jewish caucus, there were at the time 14 of us, 18 of us, 19 actually, 19. Every single Jewish member of the legislature and Jewish adjacent member of the legislature, because there are a few, voted for the mandate to teach ethnic studies in the school, which focuses on the experience of Black people, of Latinos, and of API folks and Native Americans. Every single one of us voted for that because we felt strongly about that. People need to learn about their experience and need to learn about other people's experiences in this country without a whitewashed version. We need to make sure that our kids are learning about Jews, are learning about the Holocaust, or learning about the experience of our community. So it's not a foreign concept. And that takes a lot of work. We're dealing right now, we have some real issues around some of the ways that ethnic studies are being implemented in some school districts. The original model curriculum that was produced by the California Department of Education had straight up anti-Semitism in it. We all worked very hard to remove that, and that's why we were able to support the mandate. Unfortunately, the people who wrote the anti-Semitic curriculum are now going district by district, marketing themselves as consultants to say, we'll help you implement the state mandate, and then put what they call liberated ethnic studies, which includes the anti-Semitic aspects. So we're now having to fight school district by school district. And the good thing is, it is activating members of our community around the state to get involved with their Board of Education, to go to their Board of Education or their superintendent to say, no, this is not okay. So we need to be active and monitoring what's happening in our schools.
Thank you very much, Senator Scott Wiener and Tyler Gregory. Let's give them a round of applause. Okay, let's try to get to some audience questions. We'll start on this side of the room. Yes, in the back.
Hi, thank you so much for this really important panel. My question is about as you said, Jews are not a monolith, and Jews are not monolithically white, Jews are not monolithically wealthy, but when a lot of folks, say in the Bay Area, think about the Jews they know, they might think about people who experience relative privilege, who are on the whole white passing, who in general benefit from white privilege. And so the forms of oppression of anti-Semitism, they look different than other forms of oppression that we often think about and talk about as people concerned about social justice in this country. And so I'm curious how, when you engage in this work as policymakers, community leaders, how do you have that conversation around things like the cyclical nature of anti-Semitism? For me, I have it by saying, the Jews of 1920s Germany were thought everything was fine and seemed professional and comfortable and all of that. So I guess I'm wondering, how do you address that tension between how in the micro context of here and now, we can seem like a privileged community.
I think that what you just said is exactly it. That when it comes to anti-Semitism, that it goes from 0 to 60 like that. And we have repeated instances in history when Jews were doing just fine until they weren't doing just fine. And usually that just fine doesn't mean like, they lose some economic status. It usually means they either get expelled or massacred, or their village gets burned down, and everything gets taken away from them. And so that's it's so important for people to understand that yeah, it seems like Jews are generally doing okay now, but that can change in a heartbeat, and it has changed. And anti-Semitism is also sometimes it's like the leading edge, right? When the Holocaust started, it was and the final solution. It was we need to exterminate the Jews. Well, guess what? They didn't limit themselves to Jews, right? There were 6 million Jews and 6 million non-Jews, right? They decided, well, we need to exterminate all the Poles, or we need to exterminate all the gay men, the Gypsy, the Roma, right? They did not stop with the Jews, and so it is like it's like a gateway hatred in some ways.
The other thing is just to point out in those conversations, like Jews are being murdered around the country. I mean, thank God it's not happening, all the time. But, people are going into synagogues, and people are even going to synagogues here and, threatening Jews. And so while it might seem like, oh, it's not that bad, like, I don't know. When I was in Mexico City, I had to go through so much security to get into a synagogue because they were afraid of being killed. Right? And so that's real. That's not pretend security just for show. Jews are afraid of being killed in their own houses of worship in this country.
I just want to add something. If you're a white Jew, your white privilege protects you from anti-black racism. It does not protect you from anti-Semitism. These two things are not on parallel planes. They are on totally different planes. And so we need to be able to hold, and to be clear, part of my job is educating members of the Jewish community that don't understand that and deny their white privilege because they don't get that these are different constructs. But we walk through the world as white passing Jews, or as white Jews, however you want to frame it, with white privilege and vulnerable to anti-Semitism at the same time. Both can and need to be true. And just as we need to educate non-Jews about, having white privilege but still being vulnerable, we also have to educate members of our community that they do experience white privilege. And when they go into a bank or a grocery store, they experience it differently than people of color. So it is a two-way conversation that Jews and non-Jews need to grow into. Separate planes.
All right, the gentleman in the back, and then we'll go.
When you made thank you. When you made the comment about the decision to speak up as a Jew when oppression occurs, it did strike me that the same thing happens to people that we should be conscious of when they're working and sexually assaulted, or they're gay or black, but they're also Jewish. And so they're trying to speak out as individuals can also get that kind of backlash that you referenced about, oh, the Jewish community's supporting you, or you're a privileged person. So I think it's not just the Jews facing anti-Semitism, but we ought to be conscious of the fact that fellow Jews have other issues that they need to bring to the fore, that they may also face that kind of backlash of anxiety, even about, will I be seen as privileged if I raise this issue and people come to my defense? So that there's a two-edge that people face when they have other issues, as well as thinking about their Jewish context and how that plays into it.
All right, thank you very much. This individual with the yellow hat matches Scott's chair.
Thank you. My name's Susan George, and I wanted to ask you about this incident that happened that was particularly frightening. I was with Matthew, my partner. We were at a dance club, and we were talking with some people who were from Israel. We just met them there, and we were having a great conversation. And I could tell something was wrong with her. And I asked, she said, well, I was just talking to a group of people over there. We were having a great conversation, and they detected that I had an accent. And they said, "Where are you from?" She said, "I'm from Israel." And they said, "You're a monster." And I think this is something that people don't, I'd like to get, because there's a much larger conversation there, of course, but I would like to, whatever might come to mind about those types of experiences, I'd like to bring up what happened in May of 2021 when you talked about a turning point. Something happened there where it was like, wait a minute, there's all of a sudden this rhetoric has gone way, way up because of what's happening in Israel. It's affecting Jews here. And I'm going to say something else, might not be very popular, and that is there was a leader in the Jewish community, because I was really trying to get Rusty Hicks, the head of the California Democratum, and to say something about what happened in LA at a Chinese restaurant. And he was actually told not to say anything about it because we didn't want to disrupt things. And also, maybe the Jews were responsible a little bit for what happened there. So this type of thing, I would just like to get your comments about it.
I didn't vote for him.
I mean, I think it's fair game to criticize the government of Israel. As you know, I'm a critic of particularly the current government and the settlement policy and all that. But it can quickly tip into broad generalizations and anti-Semitism. And Mr. Cutiel here has certainly experienced that when he's been targeted in a very anti-Semitic way for supporting the state of Israel to exist. They didn't ask any of the other merchants on Valencia Street. They support the right of the state of Israel to exist. Only the Jew. And so it can quickly tip, and that's why we have to be just so mindful of that.
We have a long tradition in this country of accusing people of dual loyalty with other places. I think that's number 2 on your list. And immigrants from all over the world coming to this country face the dual loyalty test. And Israel is no different in the case of the Jewish community. And much like Asian seniors are being pushed down in Chinatown, so too are Jews, because people perceive that it's okay for Jews to have collective punishment for policies that they disagree with overseas. And so we are vulnerable when it comes to Israel. Israel cannot be too controversial of a topic for us to be able to talk about when it comes to anti-Semitism. As Scott said, the Israeli government makes policies that we disagree with all the time, just like we've had many governments in this country that we've disagreed with all the time. But what you need to understand in the Jewish psyche is that there's only been 7% of Jewish history over those 3,500 years where we've had the ability to protect ourselves in a Jewish state and in a Jewish diaspora outside of the Jewish state. And so in this country, we exercise our rights in a democracy to protect our community. And in this Jewish state of Israel, so too can we keep our people safe. That has only been true for 7% of Jewish history. And so you have to understand, for that other 93% of the time, hasn't worked out so well for us. So when you're criticizing Israel, when you're criticizing policies of the Israeli government, be mindful of how we're experiencing that connection to Israel, because it is a source of stability. We want to make America our home forever, but God forbid things have happened. People know where their passport is and they have somewhere to go.
Yeah, I would just in instances like that, I would question or ask the person to investigate why they automatically hate a place, and maybe remind them that Israel is a democracy, and there's lots of people within Israel that have very strong criticisms against its government, and it has a very healthy section of society that does not support what's happening there, but live there, and it's a diverse place. And so to hate an entire place, an entire country, the only Jewish country in the world, might say something about their own biases about our people, and maybe remind them that there's a lot of different kinds of people in Israel. And then I know there's a lot of questions, but I promised the senator that he could go home, and he has to go all the way to Sacramento. Very quickly, Professor, I'll give you the final word. I'm sorry, but we have to go. It is 8:30, so go ahead, Professor.
Thank you. Just, you know, the Japanese were interned because of the belief that they would choose the Japanese emperor over the U.S. president. So this is, you know, these kinds of tropes are, you know, infectious. And I'd also say organize, protect, like we organize for the abortion clinics, you know, organize protection with the churches of San Francisco and the other synagogues. We will be there for you. Mainly what I wanted to do is I'm presenting a resolution before my union this week. And I have authored this. I'm going to read you 3 sentences. There is a spectrum of Jews and Judaism in the United States and on the campus at San Francisco State. Some of us are anti-Zionist Jews who do not hold that Zionism is a religious belief. It is a geopolitical issue. We believe that Israel is wrongly practicing violence against the Palestinian people and their government, and that Gaza and the West Bank should remain Palestinian territories, occupied only by Palestinians. We believe in peace in the region. We believe in a San Francisco State climate that welcomes all views and academic freedom. And this is because there was a survey done on campus of Jewish students, and I haven't seen this survey, I've only heard the results, that there is much anti-Semitism on the campus at San Francisco State. Wanted you to respond.
You know, unfortunately, we work closely with the San Francisco Hillel at JCRC, and those kids are just exhausted. They're burnt out. They keep raising these issues with the administration, with campus faculty, and they just want to play beer pong. Come on. Like, they don't want to have to be the representative of the Jewish people all the time, and like, they just want to be college kids and enjoy themselves, and they can't. They're exhausted. They're burned out, and that's totally not okay. At the same time, I think Lynn Mahoney has done a great job at San Francisco State of trying to listen to the Jewish community and to the Jewish kids on campus. And San Francisco State has joined what Hillel International is calling their Campus Climate Initiative, which educates administrations where there has been a historically hostile environment on concrete steps that they can do to incorporate Jewish identity into their DEI practices and to create spaces within Jewish spaces and in other public areas to make sure that Jewish identity is holistically celebrated and embraced on their campus. So, you know, I personally thanked the chancellor for entering that program, and I hope, and it's going to take all of us as a community to continue to engage on it, but I hope that it leads to some long-term improvements because it has been a challenging campus for more than 50 years.
Okay, I want to thank the San Francisco Black Jewish Unity Coalition that helped co-sponsor this event. Thank you so much for that. I'm sorry, we have to end the event. And Linda Parker Pennington, thank you so much for being here and for being such a stalwart supporter of the space and for participating in so many of our programs. Really appreciate you. I want to thank Paul Geduldig, who's the CEO of the Jewish Community Center of San Francisco, who's here and is an amazing leader in the city as well. And thank you, all of you, for coming on an evening to have this conversation and to be in community together, the Jews and non-Jews especially that showed up to listen and learn and be a part of this conversation.